The truth was that the Beatles had just split up, and it's really the equivalent for...
When people hear the name Paul McCartney, they see only one version of him, the smiling Beatle, the gentle songwriter, the man behind Hey Jude, Let It Be, and the soundtrack of peace, love, and optimism. For decades, Paul McCartney has been frozen in the public imagination as the kind one, the calm one, the Beatle who never seemed angry, never bitter, never hateful. But that image is only half the truth. Behind the soft melodies and warm interviews lived a man far more complex, far more emotional, and far more haunted than most fans ever realized. A man who carried grudges in silence. A man who remembered betrayal long after the applause faded. For years, the world believed the Beatles' greatest conflicts were about music, creative differences, money disputes, fame tearing four young men apart. But few people knew the truth. Paul McCartney didn't just argue with his bandmates. He didn't just disagree with managers or producers. He hated someone. In fact, not just one person. There were names, specific names. People who shattered his trust so deeply that he never truly forgave them. Some were friends. Some were family in everything but blood. Some were outsiders who quietly helped destroy the greatest band in history. And Paul never spoke openly about them. No public rants, no angry interviews, no explosive confessions, just silence. In this video, we uncover the hidden blacklist Paul McCartney carried for decades, the betrayals that changed the course of the Beatles forever, the quiet rage that followed him long after the final curtain fell, because behind the smiling Beatle was a man who never forgot, and the first name on that list was the one that hurt him the most, John Lennon. Paul McCartney and John Lennon were more than bandmates. They were brothers in everything but blood. Together, they wrote over 200 songs shaping not just a band, but an entire generation. Lennon-McCartney wasn't just a songwriting credit. It was a symbol of unity, balance, and creative magic. John was the rebel. Paul was the craftsman. Chaos and control somehow working in perfect harmony. But by the mid-1960s, cracks began to form. John started to resent the image Paul was building, the clean-cut Beatle, the reliable leader, the one the public trusted. To John, it felt fake, controlled, commercial. At the same time, Paul grew increasingly frustrated with John's unpredictability, his late arrivals, his lack of focus, and most of all, the constant presence of Yoko Ono, who was now everywhere John went, including the recording studio. Then everything collapsed. In 1967, their manager Brian Epstein died suddenly, and with him went the glue holding the Beatles together. The band was lost, directionless. And Paul, terrified that everything they had built was slipping away, tried to take control. He pushed harder. He demanded perfection. He tried to keep the machine alive. John wanted the opposite, freedom. In the studio, Paul's obsession with detail clashed violently with John's desire to break rules. Tension became routine. Arguments became normal. At one point, even George Harrison quit the band temporarily, unable to tolerate the pressure anymore. By the time the Beatles officially broke up, the damage was beyond repair. When Paul sued to dissolve the band's business partnership, John saw it as the ultimate betrayal. Not a legal move, a personal attack, and John retaliated the only way he knew how, through music. In 1971, Lennon released How Do You Sleep, a brutal, venom-filled song aimed directly at Paul. The only thing you'd done was yesterday. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't playful, it was cruel. Paul responded, but quietly, with too many people a restrained song full of bitterness beneath the surface. No shouting, no public war, just controlled anger wrapped in melody, and yet time slowly began to soften them. By the late 1970s, Paul and John were speaking again, laughing on the phone, reminiscing, even casually discussing the idea of working together one more time. Then came December 8, 1980. John Lennon was shot outside the Dakota Building in New York, dead within minutes. Paul McCartney was left frozen in shock. When reporters surrounded him and demanded a reaction, only 3 words escaped his mouth. "It's a drag." Those words would haunt him for years. Critics called him cold, heartless, uncaring, but the truth was simpler. He was shattered. Later, Paul admitted that John's killer didn't just end a life. He stole a piece of the Beatles' soul. What hurt most wasn't the feud. It was knowing that reconciliation had begun, and that the words Paul needed to say would now never be spoken. The hatred Paul carried toward John was never simple. It wasn't rage, it was regret. And that regret would shape how Paul handled every betrayal that followed. Because John Lennon was only the beginning. In the early 1980s, Paul McCartney believed he had found something rare, a genuine friendship. Michael Jackson wasn't just another superstar. He was younger, curious, hungry to learn, and deeply respectful of Paul's legacy. To Michael, McCartney was a living legend. To Paul, Michael felt like a little brother navigating the dangers of fame. They wrote music together, they laughed together, they trusted each other. Paul welcomed Michael into his world, sharing stories, advice, and lessons learned the hard way. One night, in what he believed was a harmless conversation, Paul revealed what he considered the real secret to lasting success in the music industry: ownership. He explained how buying song catalogs, especially those of other writers, created income that never stopped flowing, how publishing rights were power, how music, if owned correctly, could take care of an artist forever. Paul meant it as friendly wisdom. Michael heard opportunity. In 1985, the unthinkable happened. ATV Music, the company that owned most of the Beatles' song catalog, went up for sale. Paul assumed he would finally have a chance to reclaim the songs he helped create. Instead, Michael Jackson bought the entire catalog for $47.5 million. For Paul McCartney, it felt like a knife in the back. The student hadn't just learned the lesson, he had used it against his teacher. Suddenly, the songs Paul poured his soul into no longer belonged to him. They belonged to his friend. And worse, Michael didn't see the purchase as personal. To him, it was simply business. Their friendship never recovered. Even years later, when Michael faced serious financial troubles, he never sold the rights back to Paul. Instead, he partnered with Sony, turning the Beatles' legacy into a corporate asset. Privately, Paul was devastated. "I thought we were friends," he admitted quietly. That pain never fully faded. To Paul, this wasn't about money. It was about trust, about loyalty, about a line that should never have been crossed. And yet, he never publicly attacked Michael. No angry interviews, no public accusations, just distance, because Paul McCartney was learning a painful truth. Some betrayals don't come from enemies, they come from the people you let closest. And while that wound cut deep, nothing prepared him for the next name on his list. A man who didn't just betray the Beatles, he ended them forever. On a cold December night in 1980, the Beatles' story reached a point of no return. John Lennon was returning home to the Dakota Building in New York, a familiar place, a safe place. Earlier that same day, he had signed an autograph for a fan, a quiet, polite man who smiled, thanked him, and walked away. That man was Mark David Chapman. Hours later, Chapman stood in the shadows and fired 4 shots into John Lennon's back, killing him instantly. The world stopped. For Paul McCartney, the news didn't just bring grief, it erased a future. When reporters rushed toward him, demanding a reaction, Paul stood there, stunned, confused, barely able to process what had happened. And in that moment of shock, he muttered 3 words. "It's a drag." Those words would follow him for decades. Fans and critics alike judged him harshly. They called him cold, detached, unfeeling, but they never saw what happened behind closed doors. Privately, Paul was devastated. He later said that Mark David Chapman didn't just kill John Lennon. He stole a piece of the Beatles' soul. For years afterward, Paul refused to even say Chapman's name. To him, Chapman wasn't worthy of recognition. He referred to him only as a coward, a madman, a damned psycho. What made the pain unbearable was timing. Just weeks before John's death, Paul and John had started speaking again. Real conversations, warm conversations. They had even joked about the possibility of working together one more time. Not a reunion tour, not a spectacle, just 2 old friends making music again. December 8th destroyed that forever. Every tribute to the Beatles reminded Paul of what was lost. 4 men who would never stand together again. A future that vanished in a single night. And while Chapman pulled the trigger, Paul knew the damage went deeper than one man. Because the Beatles didn't fall apart only from violence, they were slowly torn from within. And the next name on Paul McCartney's list came from inside the band itself. A quiet man, a loyal man, a man who finally reached his breaking point, George Harrison. George Harrison was never the loudest Beatle. He didn't fight for attention, he didn't dominate interviews, he didn't demand control, but he watched, he listened. And over time, the frustration inside him grew quietly, dangerously. Paul McCartney's perfectionism, once the engine that drove the Beatles forward, slowly became a cage for George. Every note had to be played Paul's way. Every arrangement had to be approved. Every idea was filtered through McCartney's relentless standards. For George, it felt like being treated as a junior partner in a band he helped build. By the time the Let It Be sessions began, the tension was unbearable. The studio, once a place of joy, had become a battlefield. Cameras rolled, tempers flared, and Paul, desperate to keep control, pushed harder than ever. Then, one quiet moment changed everything. George put down his guitar. He looked around the room, and he said calmly, "See you around the clubs." Then he walked out. It wasn't a dramatic exit. No shouting, no slammed doors, just resignation. To George, years of having his ideas dismissed or rewritten felt like humiliation. He stayed polite in public, professional, respectful, but the resentment never truly disappeared. Later, George would say bluntly, "Working with Paul is like having your hands tied." After the breakup, legal disputes over Apple Corps kept the distance between them. Paul wanted control. George wanted freedom. 2 visions that could no longer coexist. To Paul, George's quiet rebellion felt like betrayal. To George, Paul's dominance felt suffocating. And though time softened their public relationship, the wound remained. Because for Paul McCartney, losing George wasn't just losing a bandmate, it was losing someone he never realized he was pushing away. Yet even that pain was not the final fracture, because the Beatles didn't just collapse, due to ego or creative conflict. They were destroyed by money. And the man Paul McCartney blamed most for that destruction wasn't a musician at all. He was a businessman, and his name was Alan Klein. When Brian Epstein died in 1967, the Beatles lost more than a manager. They lost their shield. Epstein had protected them from the business world they didn't understand. Without him, the Beatles were musical geniuses standing inside a collapsing financial empire. Apple Records, Apple Films, Apple Boutique. Money was bleeding everywhere. That's when Alan Klein appeared. He was confident, aggressive, brilliant at fighting record labels. Known for managing the Rolling Stones and Sam Cooke, Klein promised to rescue the Beatles' finances and make them richer than ever. Everyone believed him, everyone except Paul McCartney. From the very beginning, Paul didn't trust Klein. He saw him as slick, manipulative, a man who spoke like a savior but moved like a predator. Paul wanted the band to hire Eastman & Eastman, the law firm run by Linda McCartney's family, but John, George, and Ringo chose Klein. In 1969, all three signed with him. Paul refused. From that moment on, he was isolated, locked out of decisions, overruled at every turn. Klein fired employees, cut projects, and briefly improved profits. To the public, he looked like a success, but Paul was convinced Klein was stealing from them. By 1970, Paul had had enough. He sued his own bandmates, not out of a spite, but survival. He needed to escape Klein's control, even if it meant being labeled the villain who broke up the Beatles. The world turned on him. Fans blamed him. History painted him as the traitor. Time, however, told a different story. Years later, Alan Klein was exposed for fraud and forced to repay the Beatles over $800,000. John, George, and Ringo reluctantly admitted Paul had been right all along, but by then it didn't matter. The Beatles were gone. Paul McCartney later said Alan Klein was the man who killed the Beatles, not with music, but with money. And yet, even after that betrayal, another name would cut deeper than Paul ever expected. A legend, an idol, a man from an older generation who never truly respected what the Beatles stood for. Frank Sinatra. At first, there was no hatred. Paul McCartney genuinely admired Frank Sinatra. The smooth voice, the effortless charm, the elegance of a man who defined an entire golden era of music. To Paul, Sinatra represented tradition, class, and mastery. And for a time, there was mutual respect between the two legends, despite the generational divide. But that respect didn't last. As rock and roll exploded and the Beatles reshaped global culture, Sinatra began to openly mock the movement. He dismissed rock music as a pile of garbage for rebellious kids. For Paul McCartney, this wasn't just criticism. It was an insult to everything the Beatles had built. Things became personal when Sinatra publicly ridiculed Yesterday, calling it the saddest song ever written, even parodying its melody during a live performance. Paul was crushed, not because of ego, but because the song came from a deeply emotional place. Just as the wound began to heal, another slight followed. During a concert, Sinatra performed something and introduced it as the greatest love song Lennon and McCartney ever wrote. To the audience, it sounded like praise. To Paul, it was another dismissal. Something was written by George Harrison. And in that single moment, Sinatra erased George's authorship and reduced the Beatles once again to a single label, refusing to see them as individual artists. From then on, Paul understood something clearly. Sinatra would never view the Beatles as equals, only as noisy newcomers who disrupted his polished world of ballads and tuxedos. They never exchanged harsh words face to face. No public feud, no dramatic confrontation, just a cold, unspoken tension that lingered for years. It wasn't hatred fueled by anger, it was resentment fueled by disrespect. A quiet battle between two eras. Old world sophistication versus youthful rebellion. And that scar, though subtle, never fully faded. But the next name on Paul McCartney's list wasn't about ego or criticism. It was about control, about art being violated, about a song that was never supposed to sound the way the world heard it. And the man responsible was Phil Spector. By 1970, the Beatles were already falling apart. The Get Back sessions were meant to save them. Paul McCartney's attempt to strip everything down, return to live recording, and remind the band who they once were. No tricks, no layers, just four musicians in a room. Instead, it became the sound of a band breaking. Arguments, exhaustion, silence. Then came the final blow. Alan Klein, the manager Paul never trusted, hired Phil Spector to fix the recordings. Spector was famous for his wall of sound, massive orchestration, echo, and emotional overload that swallowed a song's whole. It was everything Paul hated. Paul's ballad, The Long and Winding Road, was never meant to be grand. It was fragile, intimate, a quiet confession. But Spector drowned it in strings, brass, and a women's choir burying Paul's voice beneath layers of sound. Worse still, Spector removed some of Paul's original vocals to make room for his own additions. When Paul heard the final mix, he was furious. He sent an immediate letter demanding that the strings, the brass, the choir, and all that noisiest stuff be removed. To Paul, it wasn't just a bad mix, it was a violation. His protest was ignored. In May 1970, Let It Be was released, with Spector's version intact. The album was a commercial success, but to Paul, it felt like defeat. Proof that the Beatles were no longer a band, only four men being pulled in different directions. Even longtime producer George Martin was appalled. He later remarked bitterly that the album should read, produced by George Martin and ruined by Phil Spector. Spector never apologized. He bragged that Paul had been performing his version for decades. He even won an Oscar for Let It Be. To him, it was victory. To Paul, it was theft. But Paul never forgot. More than 30 years later, he finally reclaimed his song. In 2003, he released Let It Be. Naked, stripping away the Spector's excess and restoring the music to its raw, emotional core. When The Long and Winding Road played again as Paul intended, just piano, voice, and silence, it wasn't just a remix. It was a reckoning, a quiet declaration to the world. This music is mine. And yet, after all the betrayals, feuds, and wounds, one question remained. Why did Paul McCartney never openly speak about the people he disliked? Why did he stay silent? The answer reveals more about him than any argument ever could. After decades of betrayal, conflict, and heartbreak, one question remains. Why did Paul McCartney never publicly expose the people he despised? Why did he never name enemies, never fuel feuds, never unleash his anger? The answer isn't fear, it's wisdom. Paul McCartney understands something most celebrities never learn. One angry quote can erase a lifetime of music. One bitter interview can shatter a carefully built legacy. To the world, Paul is the friendly Beatle, the symbol of peace, the voice of love. Admitting to hatred would destroy that image instantly. He wouldn't be seen as a wounded artist anymore, but as an aging man trapped in resentment. And in Britain, public bitterness is viewed as undignified. Paul knows this. His image isn't just personal, it's cultural. The Beatles are more than a band. They are a myth, a symbol of harmony and unity. And Paul understands that if he ever openly attacked John, George, Yoko, or anyone else tied to that legacy, the myth would collapse. So instead of shouting, he let the music speak. Too many people was his answer to John's rage. Melodies replaced insults, songs replaced accusations. Many of Paul's rivals were deeply connected to people he loved. Yoko was John's wife, and John, despite everything, was still his brother. To attack her publicly would reopen wounds not just for Paul, but for millions of fans around the world. Even now, in his 80s, Paul chooses grace over grudges. If he said, "I hate Sinatra," or "I despise Phil Spector," the world wouldn't remember Let It Be. They would remember only anger. So Paul smiles on stage. He keeps singing. He keeps choosing love. Silence, for him, became the highest form of forgiveness. In the end, the list Paul McCartney keeps isn't one of enemies. It's a list of lessons. Lessons about trust, about loyalty, about the cost of genius. And that's why, decades later, he still shines, still sings, and still reminds the world that love outlasts everything.